France is currently facing a range of political and economic difficulties, compounded by a wave of African nations terminating military agreements and demanding the withdrawal of French troops. In December 2024, Prime Minister Michel Barr's government collapsed following a no-confidence vote in the National Assembly. However, the challenges facing France are no longer confined to its borders. The country's influence in Africa is diminishing as several nations expel French military forces. Following the example of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, Ivory Coast made a similar decision in December 2024, announcing that French troops would begin withdrawing in January 2025. President Alassane Ouattara explained that the modernization of the Ivorian armed forces was the main reason for the move, signaling a shift towards greater self-reliance. In stark contrast, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi embarked on a diplomatic tour of Africa from January 5th to 11th, visiting Namibia, the Republic of the Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. This trip marks the 35th consecutive year that the first overseas visit of China's foreign minister has been to Africa, underscoring China's long-standing commitment to strengthening Sino-African relations. During his visit, Wang Yi is expected to further the goals of the 2024 Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, where China pledged $51 billion in fresh financial assistance. His tour will focus on expanding practical cooperation in sectors such as energy, infrastructure, and development aid, aligning with Africa's independent development goals. The diplomatic engagement between China and Africa comes at a time when several African nations are reevaluating their military relationships with former colonial powers, particularly France. In recent years, many African countries have taken decisive steps to end the presence of French military forces, reflecting a broader regional trend of asserting sovereignty and reducing foreign military influence. In Ivory Coast, President Ouattara's December 31st announcement regarding the French military withdrawal emphasized the country's progress in modernizing its armed forces to handle its own security needs. Similarly, in Senegal, Prime Minister Bassirou Diomaye declared in December 2024 that all foreign military bases, including those operated by France, would be closed, responding to growing public sentiment for the nation to manage its security independently. Chad, another key country in the Sahel, also made a bold move in November 2024 by ending its defense cooperation agreement with France, signaling a shift in its historically strong alliance with France in counterterrorism efforts. French forces began withdrawing from Chad by December 2024. Niger's military coup in July 2023 led to the suspension of its military agreements with France. The new leadership in Niger demanded the withdrawal of French troops, which France agreed to by the end of the year, signaling a significant break with its long-standing military presence in the region. Burkina Faso followed suit in early 2023, officially requesting the withdrawal of French special forces in January. By February 2023, French troops had fully withdrawn, with Burkina Faso seeking new international partnerships to address its security concerns. Mali too began distancing itself from France after a 2021 military coup, with the transitional government inviting the Russian Wagner Group for security assistance. In early 2022, France announced the withdrawal of its troops, ending nearly a decade of military operations aimed at countering Islamist insurgencies in the Sahel. This decision reflected Mali's desire to reduce its reliance on French military support. These collective actions mark a pivotal moment in Africa's post-colonial history. The decreasing French military presence reflects a growing determination among African nations to assert their independence, redefine their international relationships, and seek more diverse partnerships. While this shift poses challenges, including potential security risks, it also provides African countries with the opportunity to forge a future that that is more in line with their aspirations for self-reliance and sovereignty. The sovereignty of France's presence in Africa. France's involvement in Africa spans several centuries, characterized by exploitation, violence, and profound disruption to local societies. From the early trading posts established in the 16th century to the complex political networks of the post-colonial era, France's presence has often advanced its own economic and strategic interests, often at the cost of African people's self-determination. This report critically examines the legacy of that presence, shedding light on systemic injustices, military interventions, and economic mechanisms that have sustained French influence. Pre-colonial trading posts and the slave trade. The French initially set up coastal trading posts in regions like Senegal, St. Louis, Gorée Island, and along the Gulf of Guinea. Though these outposts officially traded goods like gold and ivory, they were also deeply implicated in the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly transporting countless Africans to the Americas. The main goal was profit. French traders often pressured local leaders through violence or manipulative treaties. The slave trade decimated traditional societies and led to the irreversible loss of human capital. The Berlin Conference and colonization. At the Berlin Conference, European powers, including France, divided Africa without consideration for indigenous boundaries, cultures, or governance systems. France's territorial claims aimed to expand its empire and exploit Africa's resources. By consolidating vast territories such as Senegal, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, Chad, and Congo, Brazzaville, France imposed an exploitative colonial system. The new borders, arbitrarily drawn, ignored ethnic and linguistic divisions, sowing seeds for future conflict. This scramble for Africa demonstrated a blatant disregard for African autonomy, driven by economic greed and the desire for national prestige, with devastating consequences for African populations. Colonial administration and policies. France portrayed assimilation as a civilizing mission, suggesting Africans could become French by abandoning their cultures and languages. In reality, only a small elite, referred to as les évolués, had access to French citizenship, while most Africans remained subjects with no political rights. When full assimilation proved unfeasible, France adopted a system of association that superficially respected some local customs. However, true power remained in French hands, with local leadership merely serving colonial interests. These policies stripped Africans of their identities and offered them little in return. Assimilation was a facade of inclusivity, serving instead as a strategy of domination and cultural erasure. Economic exploitation and forced labor. France systematically extracted resources such as rubber, cotton, cocoa, groundnuts, gold, uranium, and diamonds. The wealth generated fueled France's industrial growth, but rarely benefited local communities. Colonial administrators frequently used forced labor through the corvée system, compelling Africans to build railways, roads, and administrative buildings under harsh conditions with little or no compensation. Taxation policies further impoverished rural populations, forcing them to provide cheap labor to meet colonially imposed financial demands. Colonial rule, therefore, amounted to economic plunder, reorganizing entire regions to serve French needs while exploiting African labor and resources for foreign profit. Social and cultural displacement. While French language schools were established, they mostly served to create a small cadre of African intermediaries loyal to France. Education often marginalized local histories and cultures, reinforcing the idea of French cultural superiority. Missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, played a central role in this cultural domination, equating African spiritual practices with backwardness. Traditional beliefs were disparaged, undermining centuries of indigenous knowledge and social cohesion. Decolonization and independence movements. During both world wars, France conscripted thousands of Africans, such as the tirageurs Senegalais, to fight for freedoms in Europe that they themselves were denied at home. Many experienced racial discrimination in the French army, and their reintegration after the war was often marred by inadequate pensions and recognition. However, their military service abroad exposed them to ideas about self-determination and democracy. Intellectuals like Leopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal and Félix Houphouët-Boigny from Côte d'Ivoire advocated for greater autonomy, if not outright independence, the slow and contested path to independence. Following World War II, France reluctantly implemented reforms, granting limited political representation to African subjects. However, real power remained in French hands, and these reforms were often more about appeasing international scrutiny than empowering Africans. Under General Charles de Gaulle, African territories were forced to choose between a French community, maintaining strong ties to Paris, or immediate independence. Guinea's vote for independence under Ahmed Sékou Touré was harshly punished as France abruptly withdrew and sabotaged infrastructure. Despite growing international pressure, France ultimately relinquished formal control, but not without orchestrating post-independence agreements that ensured the new states would remain economically and militarily dependent on France. Post-colonial ties. The shadow of France-Afrique. The term France-Afrique refers to the neo-colonial networks through which France continued to exert influence in its former colonies. French operatives, most notably Jacques Foccart, maintained clandestine relationships with African leaders supporting dictators who align with French strategic and economic interests. From Omar Bongo of Gabon to Gnassingbé Bey Ayadema of Togo, France propped up autocratic rulers to ensure stability for French businesses and maintain its sphere of influence in Africa. Economic dominance. The CFA, franc and beyond. The CFA franc, initially pegged to the French franc and now tied to the euro, locks African economies into monetary policies largely dictated by the French treasury. Countries in West and Central Africa that use the CFA franc are required to deposit a portion of their foreign reserves with France, limiting their economic sovereignty. French multinationals like Total Energies, Belair, and Orange dominate critical sectors such as oil, logistics, and telecommunications, reinforcing France's economic hold on the continent. They profit from favorable contracts obtained through political backroom deals and secretive negotiations, military interventions, and base agreements. These agreements often include clauses that allow France to station troops and intervene militarily whenever it deems necessary. This has ensured France a strategic presence in key regions, enabling rapid deployment to protect French interests, often under the pretext of maintaining stability. From Chad in the 1970s to Ivory Coast in the 2000s and the Sahel in the 2010s, France has consistently intervened, shaping local power dynamics. A particularly dark moment in this history was the Rwandan genocide of 1994, during which France was accused of supporting the Hutu-led regime before and during the crisis. Following the Cold War, global pressures for democratic reforms and human rights forced France to publicly endorse democratic transitions. However, Paris continued to back compliant, authoritarian leaders over grassroots political movements, undermining genuine democracy in many former colonies. African civil society organizations, youth movements, and opposition parties have increasingly criticized France's hypocrisy, pointing to the gap between its rhetoric and on-the-ground interference. As challenges to French economic dominance grow, new global players such as China, the United States, Russia, Turkey, and other emerging economies offer African states alternative sources of investment and military support. This diversification has eroded the monopoly that France once enjoyed. Pan-African activists and youth movements are now calling for the dismantling or radical reform of the CFA franc system, seeing it as a clear remnant of colonial-era financial control. China's engagement with Africa has surged in the past 2 decades, offering vital infrastructure projects, trade partnerships, and financial support while distinguishing itself from former colonial powers. Beijing presents its approach as a win-win cooperation, focusing on respect for national sovereignty and aligning with Africa's own development goals. This partnership dates back to Cold War-era solidarity, but grew rapidly in the 2000s, spurred by China's economic growth and Africa's urgent infrastructure needs. Through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, established in 2000, trade between the two parties surged from around $10 billion in 2000 to over $200 billion by 2022. China has become one of Africa's top investors, channeling funds through concessional loans, public-private partnerships, and direct investment. A key pillar of Sino-African collaboration is the Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013 with over 50 African countries signing on to projects that include transport, energy, telecommunications, and industrial parks. For example, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, completed in 2016, reduced travel time between the two cities from days to 12 hours, boosting Ethiopia's exports. Similarly, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya has reduced freight costs by up to 5% and created thousands of jobs. China has also made significant contributions to energy development. In Uganda, the Kuruma hydroelectric power station is expected to help boost the country's electrification rate, while Ethiopia's Adama wind farm contributes significantly to the national grid and supports the government's green economy strategy. Additionally, telecommunications infrastructure has expanded, with companies like Huawei and ZTE installing fiber optic networks across the continent, enhancing internet access and e-commerce. Despite concerns over debt sustainability and labor practices, many African governments welcome China's willingness to fund large-scale projects that Western institutions often hesitate to support. Chinese firms are also investing in local workers, technology transfer, and training programs, fostering long-term capacity building. As global competition for African markets intensifies, China's focus on infrastructure, industrialization, and mutual economic benefits remains central to its strategy. In conclusion, France's centuries-long presence in Africa is deeply tied to systems of exploitation, suppression, and power imbalances. The colonial project, justified by a so-called civilizing mission, devastated African societies and economies. Despite gaining formal independence, many African countries remain trapped in neo-colonial structures that continue to hinder true self-determination, fueling poverty, conflict, and repression. However, resistance is growing, and there is a clear demand for radical change. Civil society, movements, Pan-African organizations, and progressive African leaders are pushing back against France's lingering colonial legacies and demanding an equal, respectful partnership or none at all. In today's global environment, with multiple international actors competing for influence, African states have an opportunity to assert their sovereignty and chart an autonomous path forward. True liberation from the remnants of French colonialism requires dismantling the economic, military, and cultural ties that obstruct Africa's right to self-governance and equitable development. Thank you for watching. We truly appreciate your time today. If you found our content meaningful or inspiring, please consider supporting us by liking and subscribing. Your support is invaluable. Be sure to check out another video from our channel. Now on the screen.